Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, we have Spiked's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spiked columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show today, censorship and the left, the autumn budget, and green rationing. So the left-wing YouTube channel Novara Media was deleted this week. Thankfully, it's been reinstated. But of course, this episode has raised all kinds of questions about censorship and the left and big tech censorship more broadly. I mean, Tom, do you want to talk us through what's happened?
So as you say, it was a really remarkable development, although, there's been many cases like this so far. Insofar as just their YouTube account was just out of nowhere deleted. They'd been told it had been permanently deleted. They'd broken community guidelines, but for something very strange, as if it was like fraud or mis-selling or something like this. So really quite alarming. As you say, it was re-established pretty quickly after a couple of hours after this big outcry, not just from their own supporters, but also from supporters of free speech and supporters of the media in general. Everyone came out in force. And so it was quickly rectified. It now seems like it was a sort of human error, a glitch, rather than anything actually substantial. But it does raise really serious questions. First of all, about the power of big tech. I mean, this is something which we've talked about many times, but at the same time, it can't be talked about enough, really, just how much of a kind of chokehold a handful of these platforms have over what is essentially an extension of our media, of our public square. I mean, YouTube has, north of 2 billion monthly users. If you do not have a presence on there as a kind of internet show, as videographers or whatever, then you are at a severe disadvantage. It has a real material impact on your ability to get your journalism and your work out there. So the fact that even if it is just in error, that these things can be shut down, it shows the kind of concentration of power. And then on top of that, the fact that they are making judgments on content, not in this case, it turned out, just shows how potentially censorious and dangerous that dynamic is. I mean, the other part of it, which is, of course, you need to talk about, is the fact that it can't have escaped anyone's notice that this is basically the first instance of big tech censorship, though it was accidental in this case, that the left seem to care about. Yeah. I mean, in terms of Novara Media themselves, I think it's their head of video had tweeted a year previously, I'm not sure what case it was in relation to, that when you're kicked off of Twitter, when you're kicked off of a social media platform, that's a private company's decision, it's not censorship. Unsurprisingly, he changed his tune in the wake of the Novara Media being binned and said basically the complete opposite, that these big tech firms shouldn't have this kind of power. And, we could harp on about the double standards, the silence on the deletion of accounts which are deemed to be misinformation or right-wing accounts or even hard right accounts, etc. The refusal to hold the line on free speech on any of these issues at all. I mean, even around the Donald Trump thing, I think the response from a lot of people on the left was to say, on balance, it was the right decision, but we'd rather it wasn't these billionaires making this decision, which I think that shows you how shallow their understanding is of this particular issue. But, in a sense, they own those double standards. I don't think there has been any reassessment that's happened in the wake of this. I mean, it's been kind of written up and talked up, particularly amongst some free speechers, as if maybe people on the left are finally starting to realise, or people on the kind of censorious left are finally starting to realise that age-old lesson of censorship, which is if that you do not protect even your enemies from being silenced, then you create a dynamic and an apparatus which will eventually reach unto you. I don't see any evidence of that whatsoever. Yeah. and whilst you would hope that this would be a kind of moment in which that would force some kind of new thinking from the people on that side of the argument, I really don't think it has at all.
I think the response, from that side of politics has been the same as it often is. Oh, maybe the culture war's gone a bit too far. Or maybe identity politics has gone a bit too far. And then business as usual, immediately straight afterwards, without, as you say, a kind of fundamental change in thinking. Ella?
It was interesting the way in which Novara Media had framed this, and the statement that they put out really upfronted their credentials. We are regulated by Impress, we provide a public service, even things like basically saying we interview the good guys, like the activists, the people who talk about climate change, not all these other sites that deal with crap. And there was this sense of you really saw the limitations of the defense for free speech, which is that it's the same argument that only if you're in the right set, approved by the right people, whether it be Impress or Ofcom or wherever, that you it's almost a kind of, don't you know who I am? Like, how dare you censor me? And it's a real misunderstanding of what alternative media, Spiked, Novara Media, any of these sites are meant to be about. And, you know, the exciting thing about platforms like Twitter or YouTube was that it was initially meant, the reason why it excited us was that it was meant to be a place where you heard different kinds of things, where you didn't necessarily have things that were choked by regulation, but that could push boundaries, break stories, whistleblow, all this kind of stuff. So if you go down the route of saying that it is only a small group of approved people or platforms or sites that get to have the defense and get to be basically get the privilege of free speech, then it means that you don't really believe in an alternative media, an alternative kind of playground for news or information. And, you know, it has, Tom has already said, I mean, there's lots of different examples of people who have been banned, you know, okay, people on the hard right, but also, you know, like, was it David Davis's speech on,
that was pulled
on
recently.
coronavirus passports, which was pulled. And everyone knows that any time on Twitter you even mention the word COVID passport or something like that, you immediately get that little thing on Twitter that says, warning, have you read all the headlines on this? So there's a real widespread problem with censorship or a kind of an overreach of bureaucratic regulation when it comes to people being able to talk. And it's not just, you know, this isn't just billionaires. We are also in the midst of a government bill, the online safety bill, which is trying to embolden and empower big tech to be able to have this kind of censorious overreach. But also, most importantly, is pushing this idea, this political idea, that having free speech online is a harm. So whether it be a free speech for people to post silly crap about beauty standards that harm young people, and everyone keeps bringing up Molly Russell, the young girl who died, committed suicide supposedly after seeing horrendous stuff on Instagram, right up to, you know, offensive stuff aimed towards MPs in the wake of the David Amess murder. There's a real unified sense on actually both the left and the right in the establishment that the online world is a place that needs to be regulated. And it often feels like we're the only ones that are saying, well, hang on a minute, regulation means censorship. Don't you understand this?
And doesn't the problem go a lot further than online, in fact? I mean, it is the left that is at the forefront of demanding laws on hate speech. It's the left on campus that is calling for figures to be no platformed. I mean, there just has been a broader censorious turn on the left, right?
No, completely. I mean, the left has become, let's not beat around the bush, it's synonymous with censorship. Yeah. Synonymous with intolerance. Even on a kind of general cultural level, with being kind of stiff, with being kind of uptight, with being against free speech and kind of experimentation. I mean, that is really dyed in the wool now. And it's a real tragedy as well. I mean, because it's not just a line that people trot out, but historically the left was at the forefront of challenging censorship in all of its different forms, whether that's state censorship, corporate censorship, mob censorship, on all these different fronts, which we've seen come back in new forms in recent years with a real vengeance. The left was at the forefront of challenging that. Even the radical left, you know, Rosa Luxemburg, her quotes about the importance of freedom and democracy and all the rest of it, they really echo down the ages. And her alleged heirs today, in the form of these people, are a complete embarrassment. I mean, the upshot, I think, of a lot of the discussion of the past week is that we don't want big tech making these decisions, but we want some sort of regulator to make these decisions. They want the state to make these decisions. That's effectively what they mean, which is an utterly ridiculous kind of proposition. And the entire test of freedom of speech is that whether or not you will defend the rights to speak of people who you fundamentally disagree with. And yet the list of caveats that people have today around misinformation, around hate speech, all the rest of it, things which are ultimately really subjective. And if you allow anyone, whether it's Silicon Valley oligarchs or someone at a regulator backed by the state, to make these kinds of decisions, you're going to create a really censorious dynamic, and the principle will already have been conceded. But as I say, there's been no reassessment on this front whatsoever. And I think the reason that up until this point, I mean, there's been a few kind of isolated examples of left-wingers getting caught up in this. I think the SWP got kicked off of their Facebook accounts for a little while. Was it about a year ago, or maybe it was earlier this year? Again, quite quickly reinstated, as it turns out. It was often glitches in this case. Is that people on the kind of woke left, they like to pose as being like really radical, really anti-establishment, really dangerous. The reason that big tech censorship or any of these other forms of censorship, frankly, haven't spooked them up until this point is because they're not threatening whatsoever. You know, they have this kind of performative anti-capitalism, which big companies and the news media and everyone are pretty happy to kind of indulge. And other than that, their views on identity, all these kinds of big divisive issues of the day, they're completely in line with the establishment, 100%. You know, whether it's the neo-racialism or all this new gender ideology or whatever it is. And again, that's one thing, but it just shows that I think the reason that, in a sense, the kind of Novara thing or any of these other instances shock people so much is because we know this is unusual, that this would necessarily take place, that the woke left specifically would be targeted by this stuff. And that's because the reason that they're so, up until this point, comfortable with that big tech censorship, or at least a bit more relaxed about it, the reason they're so comfortable with the state maybe stepping in in one way, shape or form, is because deep down they know that they share the values, or a lot of the values of the establishment. And anything else that they do is just kind of, you know, them acting out some sort of revolutionary fantasy that no one believes will actually come to anything. Really, I think, which is what it's coming down to. So yeah, I think it's revealing on that front, definitely.
You're watching the Spiked podcast. If you're enjoying the show so far and like what we have to say, then why don't you consider becoming a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. If you give £5 or more per month, or £50 or more per year, you can become a Spiked supporter and get a whole load of extra perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all the items in our shop, and you can bookmark articles as you browse the Spiked website. This is our way of saying thank you to those of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and it always will be. So we're incredibly grateful to those of you who hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can access Spiked. If you don't give to Spiked yet, then now is the perfect time. Just head to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Thank you. And now back to the Spiked podcast. So we should talk a bit about the government. We had the autumn budget this week and the 3-year spending review. Rishi Sunak was proudly boasting that the Conservatives are now the party of public services. Public spending has been brought up to levels not seen since the 1970s. Taxes, the highest level since the 1950s. I mean, Tom, should we talk about the politics of this first of all? I mean, what is this saying about, what is the government trying to say about itself by doing this?
Well, I think it's quite clearly trying to park its tanks on Labour's lawn. I mean, it's been doing that for a long time, but I think of any of the recent kind of big set piece kind of fiscal events, if you like, this one really makes that statement very strongly. Obviously, we've already had, this was a slightly strange budget insofar as two of the biggest kind of decisions had already been made in relation to national insurance and the corporation tax hike way back when in March. But still, it's just, it makes that really, really clear. I mean, as many people pointed out, you know, this was a budget that Gordon Brown could have delivered. And it poses a real question for the Labour Party and the left more broadly, partly because they've been pretending this hasn't happened, you know, for the best part of this parliament. They, again, trying to pretend that this is, they will revert back to Thatcherite norm any second, or this was all just nonsense or whatever. They can't say that now. I mean, so the Tory party definitely have kind of shaken off a lot of its sort of Thatcherite orthodoxies, if you like. But the problem for it is, despite the fact that Rishi Sunak could splash the cash more this time because of the fact that, you know, the OBR had revised up its growth figures for the immediate term, but you look beyond that and it all looks pretty anemic. So whilst politically this is really important, as you and Phil have written about on Spike this week, it's getting us nowhere near towards the sort of economic transformation you need to deliver that high wage, high productivity economy. So it's kind of politically interesting. Yeah. But at the same time, I think that's the most that can really be said about it, because aside from a few welcome things around infrastructure or public services or whatever, the fundamentals haven't changed, even if the political theatre of it has, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't believe the kind of mismatch in the tone of the optimism. You know, Rishi Sunak talking about this is a budget for an optimistic future. And yet then the figures that he had to announce from the OBR were essentially saying that in a few years' time, the economy is only going to be growing by around 1%, between 1% and 2%. I mean, it's quite shocking. And, you know, later on, the Institute for Fiscal Studies produced some data suggesting that, you know, household incomes are basically going to be flatlining for the next few years, which is a real terms cut. So this kind of high wage, high productivity economy feels like a bit of a mirage. It's just complete rhetoric. I mean, if the rhetoric were reality, we'd be cheering it, of course, but there doesn't seem to be any serious plan for actually getting there. Yeah,
I mean, I think you used the word distasteful in your column, Fraser, which listening to Sunak on the Today programme this morning, it was like, have you not been here for the last 18 months? I think that he and the government are really using the pandemic and the experience of it kind of perversely, actually, as a cover. So he was boasting this morning about how great it was that the economy had bounced back so much quicker and so much better than we thought. And I mean, yes, that's a good, no one wants people to have been begging in the streets. Of course, that's a good thing. But I mean, come on, what a low bar to set. Everyone seems to have forgotten what existed before the pandemic, that we were not in, as we've said many times on this podcast and elsewhere on Spiked. And Phil Mullen's written about this several times in a long read most recently, that the British economy before the pandemic, before we were talking about coronavirus, was in dire straits of a protracted period of stagnation. The word productivity, which everyone seems to now use in very flippant and shallow terms, was, no one actually talks about what it really means, what is needed resource-wise, planning-wise, to get businesses up to scratch to be able to increase productivity. There was none of that in Rishi Sunak's kind of positioning of his budget. There was a few, as you said, tinkering here or there with public services. I mean, we've just had a kind of semi-ridiculous row over the last week or so about the increase in the living wage, as if people are meant to come out on the streets and celebrate for an increase in 50p or something.
Well, that's going to get eaten up by the inflation.
Yeah. And it's using that as a cover to basically say, well, things aren't as bad as we thought it was, despite the fact that things were pretty bad before the pandemic. But it's a small point, but I think it's important that when he was criticised by Rachel Reeves, the Labour Shadow Minister, for basically cutting tax on domestic flights, and she said that this was disgraceful because, just before COP26, how dare you make it easier or cheaper for people to fly internationally? And then Martha Carney on the Today programme came out and said, isn't this an incredibly immoral position to take? And instead of saying, hang on a minute, I'm making things cheaper for people at a time when a lot of people have less money after the last 18 months and haven't seen their parents and family in Manchester or Edinburgh somewhere and would like to travel, Rishi Sunak came back and said, no, don't worry. We might have cut tax there, but we've made it more expensive for you to have long haul flights. So really we are, don't worry, we do care about the planet. And what it makes you realise is that it's become acceptable to argue that people have less in the context of a green narrative. And I think that is what infects so much of this, and actually what is missing from the commentary around this budget, is that it is now acceptable to argue for less and for people to be worse off. And in that context, Rishi Sunak doesn't have to talk about productivity. He doesn't have to talk about long-term aims of the British economy. He can just ride off the back of this little blip of a bounce back in the economy post-pandemic. And that really is distasteful.
We can talk a bit about rationing and green stuff in a minute, but I do just want to briefly touch on the fact, much commented on, that the Tory front bench were wearing their masks again. Important story, but...
It's the most ridiculous development of recent weeks, which is that the desperation to import like US-style mask culture wars, even though we're in a completely different place in terms of COVID than a lot of places in the US are, has just been so embarrassing. I mean, so the big development is since kind of Sajid Javid had to give that kind of steady as she goes speech a few weeks ago, trying to stave off pressure to introduce Plan B and all the rest of it, suggesting that he would start to wear his mask around and all the rest of it. I believe it's now become mandatory for people to wear masks in Parliament at the moment, but excluding MPs still, which is a great little double standard. But no, you had the Tory front bench at least showing up with a few notable exceptions. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg and a handful of others didn't actually go for it. But then a lot of backbenchers just not wearing them whatsoever. And then, of course, the images on the flip side of all Labour, sufficiently kind of masked up as some sort of great statement, as if we didn't watch the Labour Party conference a couple of weeks ago where they were all sat cheek by jowl without a mask in sight. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous. And I think the attachment now to masks is fascinating. First of all, this idea that masks are the only thing that stand between us and COVID cases, shooting through the roof is absolutely ridiculous. Even a proper supporter of the masks policy will concede it's a relatively minor measure, in the grand scheme of things. And yet you had Billy Bragg this week saying that he always wears his mask around. I think he was talking about ordering his breakfast. They asked him why he was wearing the mask. It's like, so they don't think I'm one of those Tories. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. But again, it feels like the more we edge out of this pandemic, the more desperation there is on the kind of lockdown fanatic set to claw back some of that kind of moral pomp that they had over the course of the past few years by trying to claim that this government is just trying to kill people. They don't want to let that go.
Hashtag Tory genocide.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that even the one of the strongest arguments, not that I agree with it, but one of the arguments that has to be made for masks is a kind of behavioural science argument, that it reminds people that there's a pandemic, that it reminds people to be careful, rather than the actual effect of putting a piece of cloth on your face.
Which, in the context of a government that is blue in the face, stating that it follows the science, is a mismatch. You know that older people on the front bench have pulled that mask out of their jacket that they've worn 5 times in the last few days. Everyone was laughing about the fact that Boris Johnson couldn't keep his over his nose. There's like, we know that masks only really work in a very beneficial way if you do it hospital style with fresh ones. And I remember when I was vaccinating people, you get trained in how to remove them and how to put them back on. Of course, no one's doing that. But in a government,
putting up a snood in front of
a government, this in particular, I think someone like Boris Johnson, who started off at, has had an about turn in a very short space of time, began the pandemic. Okay, he's been criticised for it, saying, I'm going to carry on shaking people's hands. And at least, even if it was silly in some points, maintaining that sense of normal life is a good thing to fight for. And wearing masks and covering our faces is not normal life, is now doing, as Tom says, this kind of very gesture politics stance that is just about looking like, and sitting next to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's unmasked in the other side of him. It's just like, for God's sake, the country is not so stupid, I think this is a key point, as to think, all right, pandemic's over if you all turn up without masks. Give people a little bit more credit to suggest that this whole obsession with behavioural science and messaging and comms and imaging and kind of symbolism around mask wearing is, we're not Pavlov's dogs. We're not just going to repeat what people have a sense of wearing masks where it's appropriate and binning them and returning to normality in most circumstances. It's
obviously run up to COP26. There's been a lot of sort of sideshows around it. I think it's fair to say we've had the Insulate Britain protesters out and about again, still not in prison to their own surprise.
Gluing their faces to the road.
Their faces to the road. We've got the ULEZ coming in just in time for COP26, introduced by Sadiq Khan, the ultra-low emission zone. But one of the most striking stories has been Joanna Lumley and her plea, which she's made on ITV and on BBC, and she's been doing the media rounds calling for a return to sort of wartime rationing to deal with the climate crisis. I mean, what do you make of this?
I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's one of those things where it's just a kind of slightly more extreme version of what the sort of mainstream opinion is within this particular movement. So on its own terms, it's, utterly nuts. I mean, it's as if we introduced rationing as just a kind of prudent policy response, rather than a unique situation in the middle of a war, like, where they didn't want the nation to be starved into submission, so they had to be very, very careful and ration food. It's obviously there's this desperation to treat climate. It's went from being a problem to a crisis to now it's a war, basically. That's how people like to frame it, because therefore emergency situations require emergency measures, I guess. Now, this particular proposal is probably going to get short shrift, but the kind of unspoken thing of a lot of climate discussion is that it's all about rationing, really. It's about rationing how much you can do. It's about rationing where you can go in the world. It's about rationing how your ability to get around the place easily. I mean, I thought it was interesting a couple of weeks ago, the Climate Change Committee in recent weeks has been laying a lot of criticism on the government. This is the committee that advises the government, it is independent, for basically stressing too much of the kind of tech fixes, as they see it, to climate change. So the idea that you'll have shiny new green infrastructure projects which will get us over the line of net zero. And they make the point, and most Greens make this point, I think it's fair to say, that the bulk of this has to come from what they call behavioural change, which effectively means you're doing less or more depending how you look on it. You're going to have to make your life much more difficult and much less convenient in order to save the planet. So it's one of those situations where Joanna Lumley has probably overreached a little bit, but there's a lot to what she's saying, which speaks to the kind of desire to enforce scarcity which exists within the Green movement, definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, we were talking about those discussions around flights, and even in London, we've had the ultra-low emission zone extended. I mean, that's a kind of telling you to use your car less, essentially, isn't it?
Well, it's not just telling you, it is stopping you from using your car, because any vehicle that doesn't meet the really quite stringent restrictions now you simply can't drive it unless you're able to pay £12.50 a day. And that's not just within central London. It's now extended to the North and South Circular. And, as many people are saying, if you're, watching this podcast from somewhere outside of London and laughing, be careful, because there are plans to bring in ULEZs in most major cities and towns. It's seen as a very positive green thing because it says, look what happens. We bring in the ULEZ and, emissions go down because people stop driving. It's like the same thing with smoking. It's like, yeah, because you've banned people from doing it and you've made it too expensive. But it's, the ULEZ is a perfect example of how the concept of behavioural change is so coercive because, take, for example, traveling in London is unpleasant. Driving in London is unpleasant because, not just emissions and that. There's so much traffic. There's too many people driving in London. Everyone knows that. I would very happily take a bus and read my book and enjoy the time to myself if they didn't come infrequently and if they weren't themselves always choked up in traffic. The government is not giving people more choice by putting on more public transport, by investing in new infrastructure in towns, and particularly outside of London, in northern towns and cities where it's impossible to get from one place to another without driving in many cases. There's not a proliferation of choice and saying, look at all these things, you could have a better life, a nicer time, and as a plus, it would be greener. What they're saying is we have to have less choice. And in all these things, whether it be in discussions about how much meat you eat, how much, what milk you drink, how you get your kids to school, whether or not you recycle, it's all about limiting people's choices rather than a proliferation of wealth and personal choice. And therefore, the green agenda is always going to be coercive and actually is always going to be unpopular because you don't have, there have been suggestions now that we should have a referendum on net zero or something like that, which might be a little out there, but it does bring home the fact that so much, as we've said so many times in this podcast, so much of our life, our daily life is changing for the worse, and we have never been able to have a discussion or a say on it, and something's got to give there.
Absolutely. Tom?
I think that point is really important to stress because the sort of democratic deficit, if you want to call it that, on all of these issues is so profound. Ipsos Mori had some polling out recently. It's something like 25% of the population think climate change is the most pressing issue. And unsurprisingly, that goes down as you go down social class. So it's like AB is like 35% or something, and it goes all the way down to 20 for DE, unskilled workers in the jargon. And that's so obvious. It's just the fact that people have immediate concerns about how they're going to be able to make a living, how they're going to be able to get the kids to school, all the rest of it. And all of these policies, by effect, if not by design, hammer poor and working class people disproportionately all the time. And you just think that there's not even an attempt to square that circle. It feels like you just say, why don't you buy a new van? It's utterly ridiculous. But I think what we'll start to see is these things are really starting to bite now. Up until this point, partly because a lot of these things have been slightly less ambitious, shall we say, these policies, partly because we're also now in the middle of this cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. People are starting to realise that this agenda is about pushing them around, it's about making their lives worse, and it's about doing all of that without asking them whether they want that to happen. And that's going to force some kind of response, definitely. What form it takes, I don't know. I don't think people are going to be out in the streets Gilets jaunes style yet, but something's going to happen, I think. People can't be pushed around like this forever.
Well, the people out on the street, unfortunately, are the ones pushing for greater action. We should talk about that very briefly. Insulate Britain are still out. Their own spokespeople are shocked. They thought it would last about 2 days and they'd all get banged up. But the police treat them with kid gloves. They're not being processed in the courts. Something has gone wrong there.
Something has gone very wrong. And indeed, the fact that, I'm all for, this is news and they're being interviewed and, don't want that to be banned or anything. But you have, particularly on channels like Good Morning Britain, I saw this, actually, it was quite frightening interview with one of these Insulate Britain protesters in which all she had to say for herself is, we have 3 to 4 years to save our children. And at what point
what's she done with those children?
But at what point do you start saying this is beyond reasonable discussion? Like, this is just madness. And these people are just kind of crazies, like doomsday end of the worlders. And, it's very clear that in terms of like public sentiment, things are escalating. You know, like some arsehole threw ink in their face today, a few days ago, which lots of us who are annoyed at Insulate Britain might sort of like want to chuckle at. But it's not. This is not right. This is not how protest is meant to happen. This is, you know, them getting in front of the Dartford crossing and stopping ordinary workers, as we mentioned a few weeks ago on the podcast, is not about democratic engagement. And, you know, our principle of defending freedom of protest stands unchanged by all of this. But you do have to start asking why authorities are not dealing with this in some way as a public nuisance. Rather, it has crossed over that line, I think. And, you know, you just know that if it was a Brexit protester, if it was an anti-LTN protest, as many have happened in Highbury and in Hackney, that the police are on it like a shot and break it up like a shot. But it seems to be with Insulate, you know, vicars who are protesting for Insulate Britain, that they just kind of get a pat on the back and maybe a juice box if they're getting dehydrated. And that tells you something about political priorities.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.